This is step 7 from the 7 Steps to Heaven, which you can find at LearnJazzStandards.com, a website put together by Camden Hughes. And on all of the earlier steps, it really kind of gets you ready for these later steps where you can start to play with the tune a little bit. And you have to make sure that you have the chord progressions down, the melody, the form of the tune. If you don't have that worksheet in front of you, and actually at the LearnJazzStandards.com website, all of the steps are enumerated right underneath each of these videos that I've done. Step 7 states, work on the elasticity of your time conception by playing on top of the beat, behind the beat, which would be laying back, and ahead of the beat, which is rushing or pushing. Practice with a metronome set for 2 and 4, which would be the drummer's hi-hat, and then on all 4 beats, which is a walking bass line. So I use this example in my jazz history classes to try to emphasize the difference between classical music, which time tends to be a little bit more absolute, and jazz, which they're really borrowing from an African tradition of this flexibility, because the African music really is largely the voice, the hands, the drums, and so forth. There's a kind of a plasticity where you can kind of move the beat back and forth. If you're playing with a metronome, the on top of the beat feel is really going to feel like, to a large extent, what you hear with the earlier players and the swing era players, Coleman Hawkins and Johnny Hodges and Louis Armstrong and so forth. It has almost a trampoline kind of effect, bouncing effect. And again, we're using All the Things You Are by Jerome Kern, as I've used with all the other examples. So there tends to be kind of this almost chug-a-chug-a-chug-a-chug, kind of a locomotive type of effect, where you're right on top of it, kind of riding that beat. You can definitely hear that in a lot of the swing players that played with Duke Ellington, playing right on top of the beat. Playing behind the beat is usually the most favorable kind of conception. You teach younger players. A lot of the cool style players, and even the kind of forefathers of that style, like Lester Young, would play a little behind the beat. In one of the earlier steps we talked about using legato. That usually comes into play here too. So if you're clapping along or snapping your fingers, feeling the tempo there, I usually have my class clap and try to maintain the tempo in one place. They'll usually follow me. As I slow down, I pull back behind the beat, they'll kind of come down with me. As I push ahead, they'll come up, and they'll see, that kind of push-pull thing that happens. So playing behind the beat, so there's kind of a lazy type of feel about it. And you'll definitely hear Billie Holiday sing in that manner. I have an example of her singing Georgia on My Mind, where we follow along with the sheet music underneath and can see how she's really lagging behind, just barely kind of catching up with that. Betty Carter used to sing that way, where she would almost displace a phrase by a measure or so and get way behind. The other way of thinking of the conception of the time, besides on top and behind, is of course ahead. Younger players tend to do that because there's a kind of a rushing type of caffeinated kind of approach. So it's really kind of it's a little uncomfortable to do that all the way through there. The idea, again, like I mentioned in some of the earlier steps, is to try to experience the extremes. The extremes of laying way back behind the time pushing consciously, really manipulating that to play behind the time, play ahead of the time, play on top of it. You can kind of experience this a little bit sometimes with play-alongs too. Here's a G major, so I'll play along of all the things you are. So if I'm playing on. Bouncy type of feel. Here's behind the beat. Ahead of the beat. So it has that little kind of antsy feel, kind of pushing ahead a little bit. And so you can use play-alongs where you're purposely trying to, usually it's a good idea to record yourself so you can really hear if that's being effective. If you are pushing ahead of the beat a little bit, playing behind the beat, on top of the beat, and then eventually you want to get to a point where you can kind of go back and forth between all those. So starting on top, behind, so you're able to kind of weave in and out of that. And it's hard to do that live. Sometimes you have to have a very experienced rhythm section that's going to hold the time there, so then you can pull back away from it or push ahead a little bit. Bebop players tend to, play a little bit ahead. Sonny Rollins is a good example of a great player that tends to like to kind of force the beat a little bit, push it. So really going back and forth from those different conceptions. The last part of Step 7 just talks about practicing with the metronome, as we've been doing, and on several of the earlier examples you got the idea of setting it right there would be like having it as the bass line, setting it at 4. Another good example is I was set at the quarter note at 160. If you do that in half and you make it 80 now, you got the same tempo, but you're thinking of that 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, like 2 and 4 on the hi-hat. That can be really tricky. You want to start out with just playing the chick, 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 all the beats, like the quarter, like the bass line. This is more like the hi-hat of a drum, right? 2, 3, 4. Play through an entire tune that way, thinking 2, 3, 4. It really is going to strengthen your time feel. So that's the final step of 7 Steps to Heaven, talking about working with the elasticity beat, being able to place it purposely on top, ahead, or behind, and then also using the metronome as a tool to work on a bass note conception and a 2 and 4 hi-hat conception.